Development Goals in UNDESA. Today's webinar is part one of a two-part series. Part two will be held on Thursday, 14 May, from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. We invite you to sign up for this upcoming webinar as well. But before we begin, I would like to remind you to keep your microphone and camera deactivated at all times. Please use the chat box for questions and sharing material. As your moderator, I will select questions from the chat box. I will also invite participants to take the floor to pose questions. Please do not try to take the floor unless you are invited by the moderator. If you are given the floor, please unmute yourself and indicate your name, your organization, and country before your question. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made public after the meeting. To kickstart our discussions, I invite Mr. Alex Trepelkov to set the stage by making some opening remarks. Mr. Trepelkov is the officer in charge of the Division for Sustainable Development Goals in the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. From 2010 to 2018, he served as Director of the Financing for Development Office of DESA. Prior to this, Mr. Trepelkov worked in DESA in the areas of macro and microeconomic and social policy analysis and public administration and finance. Prior to joining the UN Secretariat in 1989, Mr. Trepelkov served in the Russian diplomatic service. Mr. Trepelkov, you have the floor.
Distinguished participants, dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor and pleasure to open this webinar series organized by the Division for Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs on a timely and important topic: integrating the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development into national development plans and strategies in the context of COVID-19 response and recovery. Thank you all for being with us today. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to spread, it has caused an all-consuming global crisis and has laid to bear unprecedented health and socio-economic challenges around the world, including the deepening of inequalities between and within countries. The current crisis has highlighted the importance of properly designing and effectively implementing national sustainable development plans and strategies that help enhance resilience and build capacity to withstand external shocks such as disease outbreaks, climate change, natural disasters, as well as disruptions in trade, transport, and financial flows. The socio-economic impact of COVID-19 underscores the relevance of response and recovery measures based on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The Sustainable Development Goals, with their universal scope and interlinked nature, are more essential than ever during this crisis and its aftermath. They serve as a compass for a stronger and better response and recovery. The SDGs encourage investment in the global public goods and critical social services like healthcare, clean water, and education, which help to build resilience and capacity to cope with immediate and longer-term effects of this crisis. The global commitment to leave no one behind, embodied in the 2030 Agenda, aims to ensure that everybody has the means to cope with the crisis and to recover. Directing stimulus packages towards investments in more equitable and sustainable outcomes would not only help recovery, but would also support achieving the SDGs. At the time of crisis, we need to help the most vulnerable: women, elderly, and children, low-wage workers, persons with disabilities, marginalized and displaced population groups, as well as small and medium-sized enterprises. There is an urgent need to share the experiences and good practices that can be applied in all countries, particularly in Africa, the least developed countries, small island developing states, and some middle-income countries. New and emerging challenges, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, have added pressure to seeking innovative and integrated solutions. I am confident that this webinar series will help identify practical approaches and instruments for the integration of the 2030 Agenda into national sustainable development plans and strategies, taking into account the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the capacity of countries to implement the SDGs. Thank you.
Introduce our panelists for this first topic, which is on national planning responding to changing circumstances. Our lead speaker, Ms. Lachlan Monroe, is Associate Professor of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. Before joining the University of Ottawa, Professor Monroe served as Vice President at Canada's International Development Research Center from 2008 to 2012. Prior to that, he was Director of Policy and Planning and Chief of Staff to the President of IDRC. Our respondents, Ms. Admos Kimo is Professor and Director of the Roy and Elizabeth Brooks Doctoral College at the University of Manchester. He holds a PhD in Development Administration and Policy and has spent the last 26 years researching, teaching, and consulting in the field of international development. His current research is investigating the re-emergence of national development planning processes and the ways in which countries engage with sustainable development goals and forces of economic globalization. Mr. Beirut is Director of Environment and Development Services. He has experience promoting sustainable development in developing and developing countries. And he has worked on strategic level assessments, SDGs, integrated planning and policy assessment, and sound natural resources management. He also spent some years working in Zambia on issues of rural development and agriculture for UK ODA, which is now DFID. To begin our discussions, I invite Professor Monroe. Professor Monroe, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Amson, and good morning, everyone. Good morning from Ottawa. The work I'm going to report on, I did jointly with Admos Kimo and David Hume at the University of Manchester. And some years ago, we noticed that national development planning was making a comeback. So what I'm going to report on here is the resurgence of national development planning and try to situate that resurgence in the current crisis using the questions that that Amson has asked, namely, what is driving the resurgence of national development planning, how the new national planning is different, what lessons can be learned so far.
What lessons can be learned from the coronavirus pandemic?
Hello? Okay. What are the implications of COVID-19 for national planning, and how plans can make countries more resilient for the future? So the first thing I'd like to show is that for a long while, we actually lost interest in national development planning. Whether you look at it in the English, French, Russian, German, Spanish literatures, the peak of interest in national development planning was in about the 1970s and 80s, and it trailed off in the 1990s and 2000s. And indeed, if you go to about a point 10 years ago, you'll find that almost no one was writing anything about national development planning other than the poverty reduction strategy papers, PRSPs. In our own research, we have found that the number of countries with a national development plan has more than doubled since 2006. In 2006, we found there were 62 countries with a national development plan. Now we count 134 countries with national development plans, and almost 80% of human beings live in a country that has a national development plan. So national development planning has indeed come back and come back in style in the last decade or so. So the question then obviously is, what's driving this increase in the number of countries with a national development plan? Well, it's not who you think it might be. It's not the usual suspects. It's not the UN, not the World Bank, not the IMF, not the OECD. In fact, when we went and looked over the websites of the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, the OECD in mid-2016 and mid-2017, we found only 7 documents on national development planning other than documents related to the PRSPs, the Poverty Reduction Strategy papers. Only 7 documents on the UN, World Bank, IMF, and OECD websites. The only people who before about 2018 seemed to be really plugged into this return of planning were 2 of the economic commissions of the UN Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, and the UN Economic Commission for Africa, which had some material on their websites. So, if it comes to the international financial institutions, the OECD, the donors who are driving this resurgence of national planning, then we had to ask, well, what is behind this resurgence? So we went and we looked at the plans themselves. We collected 134 countries' national development plans in an archive. We developed a template. We subjected these plans to rigorous content analysis, and the results are published just recently in the International Development Planning Review. Someone has their microphone on, and I'm hearing somebody's kitchen activities, I think. Thank you. So it seems there are 5 different drivers pushing countries into national development planning. Hello, please mute your mic. Please mute your microphone. So 5 drivers. The first one is that the PRSPs in the highly indebted poor countries led back to national development planning. This is a fairly straightforward story where highly indebted poor countries, about 60 of them, were given debt relief on condition that they use the funds for poverty reduction. In order to ensure that the funds were used for poverty reduction, there was a policy framework and a monitoring framework that was required. And so PRSPs ended up being sort of the gateway drug, as you will, for national development planning, because they had to be national, they had to be nationally owned, they had to be comprehensive, they had to be data driven, they had to have monitoring and evaluation networks. In other words, the PRSPs became baby national development plans. But that's the story in the HIPC countries. 200 member states of the UN, and only about 60 went through the HIPC process. So there's something else at work, since we have 134 countries with national development plans. In some other countries, the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and the SDGs became a driving force for national development planning, especially the SDGs. The plans coming out in 2011, 12, 13, 14, under the dying days of the MDGs, did not really refer to the MDGs very often. But the SDGs and the commitments made under the 2030 Agenda, and again, the need for evidence and planning and follow-up promoted a return to development planning in another probably 30 or 40 countries. But then there are 3 sets of drivers of national development planning that have nothing to do with the 2030 Agenda or the SDGs. For about 15 emerging countries, you find that the national development plans are tools of activist states. Please, can you please mute your microphone? Somebody's preparing food in the background. I can hear you. Hello? Okay. Carry on regardless.
I'm going to mute everyone for one moment, and then you can unmute yourself again. I'm just going to unmute everyone, and then you could unmute yourself. One moment.
Okay. Okay, I'm back. Okay, thanks very much. Thanks, Samson. For about 15 or 20 emerging economies, the National Development Plan was a tool of an activist state to manage the downside risks of globalization, to build up national value chains, to build up national champions, national firms who would be leaders in certain technological fields or certain key industries. In a related pattern, the fourth driver is that national development plans are in some high-income countries and some other countries tools of national transformation. This is especially true in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and in some countries of the former Soviet Union, where, for example, in the Gulf countries, the National Development Plan is seen as a tool to a post-petroleum economy. And in parts of this former Soviet Union, the National Development Plan is a way of integrating certain countries into the European sphere and away from the Russian sphere of influence. And finally, there's a group of about a dozen countries where national development planning is a means to promote an agenda that is entirely different from the SDGs. A masculinist, productionist, anti-environmentalist, nationalist, economic, social, and authoritarian political agenda. I call these countries the development dissidents. You can read all about that in my article in the International Development Planning Review. Next slide, please. So, what's new and different in the new generation of national development planning? Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah. How are things different with this generation of national development planning? Well, the old development plans of the 1940s, 50s, are top-down, goal-driven, target-driven plans, a rational blueprint, lots of evidence. We mobilize around achieving those targets. That's the classic Gosplan model. We call that type A of planning, and that's only about a quarter of the national development plans. This table comes from an article that Adnos Chimo and David Hume and I published in World Development last year. About 12% of plans are what we call type C. There are also these goal-driven plans, top-down, but with poor evidence, poor technical quality, and limited social involvement, limited political commitment to the plan outside of the base. What's really interesting is the right-hand column of plans, type B and type D. These are largely bottom-up processes. They're based on a communicative or collaborative rationality rather than an ends-means rationality. They're not blueprint plans. They tend to be adaptive, or at least attempt to be adaptive. And about 40% of plans are this bottom-up communicative rationality-based plan with strong evidence, strong technical features, and a lot of social embeddedness, a lot of buy-in from various political and social actors. And D plans have the same sort of process, but have weak technical features or a weak evidence base, and they're about 20% of the plans. But a good 60% of national development plans are now this type of communicative, collaborative rationality based on continuous improvement and consensus building rather than on a preset set of targets that we attempt at all costs to achieve. Next slide, please. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah. So generation of national development plans. Well, it's early days, so it's hard to tell a lot of things. But what's really fascinating is that most governments have a felt need to produce a plan. 134 countries out of 192 member states, even non-states or states that aren't internationally recognized, places like Somaliland feel a need to produce a plan. Many governments are putting considerable resources into their planning process. Many of these documents show evidence of large-scale mobilization of government resources, especially government technical staff, for putting these plans together. And many, though not all governments, are indeed putting great efforts into actually implementing them. These are not all just the paper plans that we all knew in the 1960s and 70s, where you produce a plan, you put it on the shelf and forget about it. A large number of the plans now are based on this collaborative rationality rather than ends means rationality. So that's a new feature in national development planning, and it actually bodes fairly well for planning during a crisis, because if you read the planning literature recently, things like adaptive planning, planning in response to complexity, etc., are all the rage in the literature these days. Most plans don't take gender or inequality at all seriously. I have a list here of national development plans that may have absolutely zero mentions of gender, zero mentions of inequality, or maybe just one or two mentions of them in the whole. And these plans are often hundreds of pages long, so there's lots of space to mention gender inequality. So despite SDG 5 and SDG 10, the whole part of the 2030 agenda hasn't really taken root in national development plans, not even in the ones done since 2016. Next slide, please. Next slide. And okay, so let's talk a little bit about the COVID-19 crisis and resilience. So one of the things that's going to be interesting to watch is how the type A and C plans, that is the type A plans based on top-down ends means rationality, compare with the type B and D plans. Can you please mute your mic? Karima El-Khoury, can you please mute your mic? Dr. Tola, can you please mute your mic? I'm getting terrible feedback here. Thank you. So one of the key questions will be, how will the type A and C plans, the top-down ends means plans, compare to the type D and B plans based on consensus building, collaborative rationality, and continuous improvement? And that's something we're going to be watching in the next couple of months and years. Many plans seek to build resilience, usually in the environmental sense, usually in small island states. But the word resilience is used in a lot of plans. It'll be interesting to see how resilient some of these plans are to the current crisis. And don't forget, the third and fourth drivers of national planning were attempts to manage the downside risks of liberal globalization, or to fundamentally transform the national project. So as you see the crisis carrying through, reacting to the relatively narrow base of suppliers for a given product, fragile international supply chains, people are starting to say, well, maybe we should build some of these things at home, even if it is a little bit more expensive. That'll be safer than relying on long, fragile international supply chains. So a lot of the themes that have been raised in some of these national development plans are indeed coming out in the COVID-19 crisis policy making. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. That's it from me. I'll be happy to take any questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you for that very engaging presentation. And I now invite our two respondents, Mr. Chimau and Mr. Dalal Clayton. You have 5 minutes each.
Thank you, Emson, and thank you very much to Lachlan for a very interesting presentation. I have got 3 key points that I would like to raise emerge from this presentation. Lachlan and I have worked on this topic as co-researchers, and what I'm just going to try and do then is try and engage with some of the things that are emerging from this that we think are relevant to a post-COVID world. So what does this post-COVID world present for us? It presents a new opportunity to look again at the effectiveness of national development planning as a response to the crisis. You recall from the beginning that Lachlan engaged with this idea that national development is seen as a way of responding to what Danny Roderick in his paper, seminal paper, Trilemma, where countries are engaging with the conflicting demands of economic globalization on the one hand, preservation of the nation state on the other hand, and the demands for democracy and democratization at the local level. So one of the things that we have seen, particularly as we've gone on with this research, is the fact that the key challenge has been how to integrate 2 forms of interventions. So on the one hand, you've got sustainable development goals, which have been embraced by all countries. And on the other hand, you also have now got the emergence of these national development plans. In some ways, you could say the current dichotomy is a reflection of the fact that sustainable development processes.
We cannot hear you.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Catch anything at all I said, or do I need to?
You can repeat your last point on the dichotomy.
Thank you. So the point I was making there is the fact that in many countries, what we've seen is 2 parallel processes of planning, where on the one hand, you've got institutions responding to sustainable development goals being separate from those institutions that are responding to this national dilemma of how do you respond to the forces of economic globalization. And in many countries, you actually find that these are situated in different ministries. So, in terms then of the responses, we can see 2 types of responses. One, which we can, let's start with the institutional. The institutional one relates to changing norms of planning, because what COVID has demonstrated to us is the fact that many of the responses to global crises, although national in nature, still need to be engaged at the local level. So again, part of the blind side of national planning has been this missing link between national and sub-national plans. We've seen how in some countries it's city mayors of large metropolitan regions who have actually led the responses which have made the difference. And in many cases for COVID, it's these responses at city regional level which will determine the success or failure of the responses. So in a way, you can say there's going to be a new norming here, a recognition that in addition to producing these plans for economic transformation, we need to pay attention to the nature of the responses and engagement with global forces. That's one. And two, we also can talk about structural responses. One of the things that we found in our work is the extent to which the National Planning Ministry often makes a difference whether or not the plan itself, irrespective of what type it is effective. We know, for example, in many African countries that the fact that the national plans were removed and placed within the economic planning ministries, which happen also to house those institutions that produce national budgets, often means that planning is taken seriously. Whereas where it has been hived off and placed in, let's say, the president's office, you often see this lessening of the effectiveness of national development planning. Now, one of the things we've also noticed is the fact that the structural changes often therefore mean there are questions about the effectiveness of these documents, particularly when they are driven from that lacks, let's say, the credibility or the muscle to see them through. The third and last point I would like to highlight is to do with what we see as some of the impediments. The biggest one we've come across is capacity, particularly to produce plans and to think across the board. So what you tend to find is this lack of integrated skills, where somebody is working in a Ministry of Economic and Finance, they often see themselves as being primarily responsible for the budget. And when somebody is working, let's say, in the ministry that's responsible for sustainable development goals, they often see themselves as responding to the social challenges that are faced by society. And therefore, this bifurcation often creates some disjunctures in terms of the policy implementation, and which is why sometimes you find that there's a lack of with respect to implementation of both the national plan and also in some situations the sustainable development goals themselves. So the issue of capacity covers three main areas. One, which is to do with the technical skills to actually produce a plan and to integrate sustainable development goals in the process of producing the plan. Many of the plans, if you look at them, they are still using the input-output models for scenario building and so on, and many will not even engage with some of the key debates around sustainable development goals. So those technical skills aside, you also find an important need for what we call softer skills, which create embeddedness of a plan. So these are more to do with creating new technocrats who can engage and recognize the importance of non-state actors and their contributions to the achievement of sustainable development goals. So you don't just see national plans as a platform where the state performs its dance and mesmerizes the citizens, but you begin to see them as a process of building national consensus from the bottom up. That is a very important point here. And one of the things we have seen and learned from is the fact that countries that have been able to develop their capacity have done so by integrating the expertise that's required. So you bring together your economists, you bring together people who work in the social sector, the private sector, you bring together the civil society organizations, and you bring together all your planners and policymakers in something that might be called a national community of practice, which helps to drive this process forward. And in some regions, we've seen actually the emergence of something that's almost like a regional community of practice, where countries will come together to share experiences on how best to plan for and implement sustainable development goals, and how to integrate these into existing national development plans. I'm going to stop here, Emson, and otherwise, thank you for inviting us to participate in this very exciting and timely intervention.
Thank you, Admos, for those very interesting remarks. Mr. Berry, you have 5 minutes. Berry, you have the floor now. Is Barry still with us? Mr. Barry Dallan might have dropped off. But we don't know whether Barry is still with us or not. But in the interest of...
It looks like we have him online. I don't know if he's shown as online.
Okay.
Please send him a chat message, and maybe we can continue with 1 or 2 questions.
Yes, I think that would be a good thing. So I think we'll give Barry a chance to make his remarks. But we did get some questions. People have been posting a lot of questions. So maybe Lachlan and Admos can respond to some of these. Ms. Karima Elkori from Esquire in Beirut is asking, what tools could be developed to enhance member states' understanding of the linkages between COVID-19 response and recovery and efforts to achieve the SDGs? And the second question from Liniana Corpeza from the Mission of Bolivia to Europe. How can we ensure that the stimulus packages or recovery strategies in the post-COVID period I get my questions, but let me repeat them. We get some questions from participants from all over the world. The first question is from Ms. Karima Elkori from Esquire in Beirut. She would like to know what tools could be developed to enhance member states' understanding of the linkages between COVID-19 response and recovery and efforts to achieve the SDGs. Ms. Rose Kefas, who is with the President's Office on SDGs in Nigeria, is asking, COVID-19 has set Africa back on the attainment of the SDGs. What strategies can governments take to kickstart the attainment of the SDGs?
Amson, if I may, I'll go ahead. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So to get to Karima El-Khoury's question about tools, as Admos and I said in our article in World Development, the communicative rationality is embedded in about 60% of the new national development plans. And that is a rationality that isn't based on setting a set of objectives ahead of time and then doggedly pursuing them regardless. It's more it's less informed by Gauss plan and results-based management than it is by Japanese management theory. Basically, continuous improvement is the spirit. Team building, consensus. What we've seen a lot of that in some of the new generations of national development planning. In your region, we've seen relatively few of those plans, frankly, and that may be because of political dynamics, because of course national development plans and national development planning are deeply political exercises. For Liliana Oporeza from the Bolivian mission to the UN, how can we ensure stimulus packages or recovery packages in post-COVID can integrate sustainability? It's an excellent question. And one of the lessons we should have learned from the 2008 and 2009 crisis was that when you bail people out, you should have stringent conditions attached to the bailout. And that clearly didn't happen I don't think, in any of the countries that were at the core of the 2008 crisis, which was the last great global recession. We're starting to see governments act a little bit smarter today. For example, here in Canada, the government has announced lines of credit to large employers, but it comes with a whole series of strings attached. You have to maintain employment, you have to maintain investment levels, you have to maintain a transparent financial structure. You have to commit to meet environmental standards on into the future in order to qualify for these loans. So I think governments are beginning to discover some of those tools, and there is some hope that some parts of the stimulus packages in at least some countries are building sustainability in.
Thank you for that. I don't know whether Admos have any response to those questions as well.
Yes. I can just add to what Lachlan has said. So on in terms of the tools, yes, I do agree with Lachlan that depending on the type of planning tradition in your country, the responses will probably be very different. In some countries, you will be told what to do. In other countries, you'll be consulted on what you think needs to happen. But I think that by and large, you need to see the response as being relating to two approaches. So on the one hand, you've got a necessary response to a crisis of epic proportions. And therefore, what you're likely to see is maybe some sort of program or projectized development that picks up on certain core areas that have been affected. But it does not supplant the existence of long-term planning goals and ideals, and we still need to link to that. So I can see in terms of planning, need to revise some of the targets that have been set in national development plans. You still see a need to revisit sustainable development goals and do an audit of which ones have been adversely affected. But alongside that, it is almost imperative that there will be some sort of a crisis response programming activity that will respond to the more immediate things. And I think in some countries, you've already seen countries already beginning to go to the drawing board to come up with a post-COVID recovery plan, which in some senses links in to or alters some of the set goals already. The response to the second one, yeah, I agree with Lachlan's response to that one, but I think that in terms of strategies, it does seem to me like if we were still in the old global order, where institutions of global governance could come together, it seems to me like member states of the UN have gotten to lobby for the establishment of something that is akin to a Marshall Plan that will help countries to recover from COVID. And because if that doesn't happen, what you're just going to see is a diversion of resources from some of the more important sectors into these recovery plans or recovery programs that will come up, and which will actually set countries back in terms of their achievements. So my thinking is to try and encourage member states to see if they can come up with this type of, I'm calling it a Marshall Plan, but this is essentially a COVID recovery plan, which may be existing IFIs, but the UN stands as a very good example of a platform where such consensus can be built.
Thank you, Admos, for those responses. Do we have Barry back? Is Barry online?
Constantly attending hospital appointments. About 5 weeks in early 2019, yet again, she was admitted to the hospital.
If you can hear me, you can also make your 5-minute presentation.
This evening, said here, she said ill in November and experienced sporadically. She missed most for Christmas exam.
It looks like we still have problems having Barry online. So I think we have about 9 more minutes for this session, so I can maybe ask a few more questions. One question is from Ms. Ola Sidani, who is from Lebanon. And she's asking, how can an indebted country facing severe economic and financial crisis and shortage of funding effectively integrate Agenda 2030 into implementationable strategies?
Admos, why don't you take that one first?
Admos? Lachlan, you might as well go since Admos, I don't think you can.
Okay, well, as we said a decade ago, but didn't learn it, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. So crises are often times of great political and economic creativity. Private sector and civil society actors develop new ways of organizing, often on cooperative grounds.
Is relating to the role of women in water resource management in the global north.
Hello, I'm getting a lot of background noise here. But also, the advantage of a crisis is that all political assumptions. Absent, can we try to mute everyone, please?
All right.
Okay. A political crisis or an economic crisis is a terrible thing to waste because all previous, things that were taken for granted get thrown out the window, and it's a time for great creativity in policy making and in social organization by civil society and responses by the private sector. Old ideas, that were around for a long time can get tried out. They might not have been acceptable 2 months ago, but we're trying them out today. You're seeing that all over the world in response to COVID. Things like universal basic income, are back on the table in serious policy discussions in lots of countries. Huge expansions of the welfare state in a lot of countries, here in Canada notably. So crises, despite the shortage of resources and the panic they bring, they can be interesting times for policy innovation. So I would look for the opportunities for policy innovation.
Yes, I agree with that, Lachlan. And the only thing that I would add is, and again, I speak here as a researcher and based on the evidence we've seen ourselves, the reason why government plans sometimes is because there's a crisis. And the planning itself is often seen as a way of assuring people that people know that the government knows that there's something that's not right. And a plan in some situations gives an assurance that something is being done about the issue, because if there is no planning, it actually creates more pessimism. But just to add on to that, it is also the case that when in a crisis, it might present you an opportunity to begin to build new consensus. And from our work, we know that if you are on the type B type of plan, which is a plan that's being produced with participation of citizens, with the intention of capturing the aspirations of the citizens, and with the intention of using the plan-making process as a way of building citizenship, you can actually find something positive to take out of a crisis in situations like that. But the key point to realize here is that in this situation, you can either choose to look at a plan as an instrument which a government simply uses to tell people how it's responding to the difficult situations, or it is a process that helps to build citizenship and to build local consensus and a possible way forward out of the crisis.
Can I just add one little thing on that? Anisha Abdullah has asked how the element of political will or consensus has it been considered in determining the success of National Development Plan implementation? I think that's a great question. I think it depends on the type of regime. I think the type B and D plans that are based on collaborative rationality work in a relatively open political regime. However, the traditional top-down plans can deliver development results if you have a determined, well-organized government who's willing to impose them on the population and who doesn't care much about consensus or political blowback.
Thank you very much for that. I think this also is a question coming from Ms. Aranza Archer, who is with the UNESCO Center Basque Country. I think it speaks to some of the issues that Admos has just pointed out. How can we emphasize to the general public, to decision makers and other stakeholders, that the Agenda 2030 provides a solid framework to react to the interconnectedness of the COVID-19 impacts?
That is a very important question here, and I would like to acknowledge the role of global institutions here, including UNDESA, in trying to help to build a consensus around the integrated responses, because as an institution of global governance, UNDESA, for example, has the reach and respect within almost all institutions to be able to bring together a new planning framework, taking advantage of this reset button we've just been given through this tragic pandemic we are experiencing. So if you ask me, I would say although it's an important thing to talk about national institutions and encouraging them to do that, there's often, from our experience of the research, there's often a competition among national institutions in terms of who takes a lead and so on. Sometimes I do find that when you've got an outside agency like coming up to have best tools to use in integrating this,
Thank you, Admos and Professor Lachlan, for those very interesting remarks. Now we turn to our next topic, which is the second part of this morning's webinar. This topic is integration at the country level, good practices and lessons learned, including COVID-19 response measures. Our lead-off presentation will be made by Ms. Boitemelo Ndi of Modimo, who is with UNDP Botswana. We will also have two respondents to Ms. Boitemelo's presentation. First, we'll hear from Ms. Susanna Tumku, who is with the National Development Agency in Mongolia, followed by Ms. Kerry Grenade, who is with the Ministry of Finance in Grenada. To guide our deliberations for this session, I would like us to focus on the following guiding questions. What are good practices in moving beyond alignment of plans and the Sustainable Development Goals and towards fundamental integration? How is development planning helping countries respond to the COVID crisis? What are good practices that can be shared? And how can development planning be made more adaptive to shock like the COVID-19 crisis? Our lead speaker, Ms. Boitemelo of Modimo, is the SDG project manager with UNDP Botswana. She's a former director for the Trade, Industry and Finance Investment Directorate at the Secretariat of the Southern African Development Community, SADC, as an official in the Ministry of Investment, Trade and Industry. Sumku is a senior specialist in development policy and planning with the Department of National Development Agency of Mongolia. Ms. Sumku is a sustainability and development professional with a track record of designing and executing policy coherence assessments, policy and institutional solutions for sustainable development, localizing and mainstreaming the SDGs. Our second respondent is Ms. Kerry Grenade, who is macroeconomic advisor in the Ministry of Finance of Grenada. She's a macroeconomist currently serving as a macroeconomic advisor in the Ministry of Finance. Previously, she held senior positions at the Caribbean Development Bank and the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. To begin our discussions, I invite Ms. Boitemelo. You have 10 minutes.
Emerson, can you hear me?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Hello, Emerson? Hello?
Yes, you can go ahead. We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And let me say good day to all the participants across the globe. My topic is building on what the previous presenters have talked about, but I'm going to be looking at this issue of integration from a country perspective. And in that context, reflect a little bit on what good practices or what lessons we have learned integrating the SDGs in the planning instruments in Botswana, and reflect a little bit on how the country has responded to COVID-19. Let me kickstart my presentation. Can we go to the next slide, please? Let me just kickstart this presentation by indicating that or reflecting what I had shared with a group of experts not so long ago when they met in a meeting to discuss this very topic of integrating the 2030 agenda and planning instruments, where I indicated that for Botswana, the 2030 agenda has been very, very instrumental in the formulation of the planning instruments. And what planning instruments am I talking about? I'm referring here to our vision document, Vision 2036. I'm also referring here to our current National Development Plan, NDP 11. And to that extent, I want to emphasize the point that these three documents, therefore, the 2030 agenda, the vision document, and the current development plan, NDP 11, are very strongly aligned. You will also be aware that the 2030 agenda in particular is an agenda. And when you look at our vision document, when you look at our national development plan, these documents are talking transformation, transformation, transformation. And one of the key objectives that we would want to attain as a country going to vision to 2036, at the end of our vision period, we have transformed the country from a middle-income developing country to a high-income country. So it is really transformation, and as I say, the 2030 agenda has been very, very instrumental in influencing the future that we want as a country. I want to say, perhaps talk not so much with the analysis that the previous presenters have. I'm still on the first slide, please. Just to also say, ordinarily, national development plans, and this is the case with our plan, national development plans are designed with the objective to help the country address the development challenges and needs of the country. But they're also designed to help the country address or meet the obligations that the country would have taken either in a global or a continental or a regional arrangement. So the plan would then provide for policies, it would provide for the strategies, it would make provision for programs and projects that would then have to be implemented in order for the country to meet the development challenges or the priorities of the countries that have been set. And this is how, in the case of Botswana, we have progressed with our development planning since engaged in development planning as far back as 1965, when we had our first development plan. Our current development plan, the NDP 11, has emphasized a lot on monitoring and evaluation. And it has emphasized monitoring and evaluation with a view to ensuring that the government priorities as set out in the plan or in the plans that will lead to the vision are actually tracked, they're monitored. And in this context, within this current period, we have seen the development of an M&A policy accompanied by a manual that supports those that are implementing to implement the policy, and most importantly, a national development plan performance framework. And maybe I should just spend a little bit of time around this national planning framework, because this is the framework or the instrument that has in a way motivated or led to the development of what we now look at as a tool that will help or that will enhance the integration of the SDGs in the planning instruments. So this NDP 11 performance framework was developed with high-level priorities or key performance indicators that are supposed to be tracked. And number 88 are contained in that document. And when we looked at that particular document, we noticed that the minimal representation of the SDG target and indicators in that particular document. Whereas the document has quite a number of programs, quite a number of projects, quite a number of policies that are to address the development agenda. In terms of representation and the SDG agenda, we found that only 30% of the SDG indicators, for instance, were in that framework. We found that compared to the global indicator framework, which is the starting point for domestication of this global agenda, there was only about 13% of the SDG indicators out of the 209 that the country has accepted as being or applicable to the country. So this made us, from the UNDP office, working with the Ministry of Finance, which is the ministry that is coordinating implementation of the SDG agenda in the country, it compelled us to look at best practices with regard to how we can enhance the integration of the SDGs in the agenda. Although there are these many projects, there are these many programs that are implemented by the government, and in a way will contribute to the attainment of the SDGs. What we found lacking was a process that will ensure that the specific SDG targets and indicators are addressed, and the specific and progress made with regard to those indicators or with regard to those targets is tracked. Let me go to the next slide, please. So this, for us, was simply an alignment of the SDGs or an alignment of the programs to the SDG agenda. We then came up with the SDG planning guidelines, whose main objective was really to enhance, as I said earlier, integration of the SDGs in the planning instruments. And these planning guidelines, they promote the use of a structured approach in the integration of the SDGs. And what do I mean by a structured approach? This approach uses a systematic process to plan. And in that process, you are looking at the specific targets that you would want to reach as a country. And you are planning in a manner that ensures that you will be able to track, to ensure that the planning is informed. It is based on planning, or decision-making is based on evidence. And this evidence makes use of data. And this data is therefore to inform policymaking or to inform planning that the country would be engaged in. The structured approach is methodical. You would use a method. In the SDG literature, we talk a lot about the internationally accepted methodologies for SDGs, where within the framework that has been approved with the targets, with the indicators, then the indicators themselves have got a method for calculation. They are defined very clearly, and they have a method that you would use for calculating. And in calculating, you are continuously checking how you are doing with regard to that particular object that you would want to obtain or to reach. In the course of doing that, of course, through the structured approach, you may have to adjust the policy, program, or the project that you are implementing. But at the end of the day, as I said, the idea is to integrate the SDG targets and the indicators in that specific policy instrument. The guidelines talk about 5 stages or a process that entails 5 stages. We will be aware that from the global indicator framework, and as I said, I talked earlier about the domestication process. Once the government would have approved or signed to this international framework, to this global framework, then what we did as a country was to confirm, to take this global framework and to see what aspects of the framework were applicable or relevant to the country. So this, in guiding the process, the guidelines say, first confirm which targets or which goals, which targets, which indicators are applicable or relevant to the country. You then have to engage in a process of prioritization, because we are here talking about a framework that has a total of 232 indicators, 169 targets, and 17 goals, and that is a lot. When you prioritize, you also have the opportunity, because in the course of implementation, some of the targets would ordinarily be attained based on what you will have done before. So you need to attain some of the targets before you can go to the next ones. So it is a building up approach. So you'll have to prioritize, and in doing that and moving on to implement, you'll have to then collect the data, which will help now in planning. And this is where for us we have found a lot of challenges with regard to data, and I want to believe challenges also apply to many other countries, because you are here then required to have the data to use to plan, but you also need to have the skills, the understanding around the indicators, what they mean, how to apply them, what is required for you to be able to work with that particular indicator, and the data that is also required for you to work with that indicator. So a lot of challenges around that, which requires a whole evolution of skills and reform around the indicators. You then have to have the targets that you have to you want to attain, whether on an incremental basis up to 2030. So set the targets and set the annual targets so that you are able to review as you proceed whether you have been able to attain the targets that you have set. And most importantly, those targets and indicators have to be integrated in the planning frameworks. And this is what, at this stage, we are trying to do. And we are piloting these planning guidelines in 6 ministries. The process is yet to advance following this crisis that we are facing today. Can we move to the next slide? And therefore, we see these planning guidelines as a good practice tool. They will help us to move beyond just the alignment process that I talked to about, that regardless of the many programs, the many strategies that we have in place, they simply are saying to us, yes, the SDG agenda is there and we have these programs and we can contribute, and these projects, these programs can contribute to the attainment of the SDGs without the tools to measure the progress that is being made. So these guidelines will enable us to structured way to measure the progress that we are making. We see these tools also as an enabler for us to accelerate implementation of the SDGs during this period or this decade of delivery and action on SDGs. If we can really embrace a structured process and be able to look back and reflect how we are doing on a continuous basis. But in the context of, again, this COVID-19, which leads me to the last part of my presentation. In the context of COVID-19 and the shock that this pandemic has subjected the economy too. We see this structured approach having offered an opportunity to, or as a means to look at the whole SDGs agenda and how we are moving with this agenda. Enables us to comprehensively measure, depending on the extent to which we have been able to integrate the SDGs in our planning frameworks. It enables us to see what has been lost and what the country would have gained, or what the country has gained. As previous speakers have said, the crisis has not only contributed to, or it is not all about what we are to lose. It is also about what can be gained out of the crisis. And you are able, through this engagement with the SDG agenda, to be able to look comprehensively at the total development agenda and see what you need to correct at point in time and in future. How has Botswana responded? A lot has been said by the previous speakers about the type of development plans that the countries have put in place. And I want to believe in our case, we fall on the right-hand side of the diagram that was given, the type B and D plans, where the country has adopted a bottom-up approach to planning, a lot of consultations in developing the plans. And in this current crisis, we have seen the government being able to respond and come up with an effective response plan for COVID-19 that is anchored on four broad strategies. One, supporting the community or the population in general, just to make sure that Botswana are not starved. Botswana still survive during the COVID-19, and they are supported through government support, at least with food packages, especially that some of them may have lost jobs, some of them may not be able to undertake the day-to-day activities that were income generating for them. But we've also seen some relief measures that are supporting the companies by way of wage subsidies, so that at the end of this crisis, at least the firms or the companies would still have retained their employees and be able to continue from where they were when the crisis struck. We have seen also some stabilization measures that can be introduced through the use of monetary and exchange rate policies. Also, government responding to ensure that at least the strategy themselves are adequately capacitated, or they hold sufficient capacity that would take the country beyond the period of the crisis, especially focusing on the fuel and the grains. But we've also seen right now there's a lot of focus what stimulus package after COVID-19 can be put in place to resuscitate the economy. An effective planning process, which has been very consultative. And I also want to indicate the important role that ICT has played and continues to play and will continue to play to facilitate that consultation that has been taking place even during this period of the crisis. Out of this crisis, and as has been mentioned by previous speakers, out of this, I think a number of lessons have been learned by the country. This has prompted the need to reflect and refocus the priorities of the plan. And this is an ongoing debate right now with regard to whether the priorities that were initially set are still quite relevant. How can they be adjusted? Just before the crisis, we are at the tail end of finalizing the midterm review of NDP. And this is also a wake-up call to really say our priorities enough, still relevant. Are they relevant? What do we need to do that now that at least we have waken up to something that was not expected? I've seen the importance of partnerships, and not only with the local organizations, the private sector, how they have partnered with the government to arrest the social negative effects of this. But we have seen the international community also come in to also work with government towards this pandemic. I think, as I mentioned again about ICT and the priorities, renewed focus, e-learning, something that is being pushed by the pandemic. E-government, these are some of the priorities that we see now government talking about within the context of this crisis. And perhaps one last point to just say, perhaps not necessarily the case for Botswana, but we see in some countries that it is also important during times like this to also look at what what capabilities countries has, and perhaps the use of indigenous knowledge. What is it that we have? Madagascar, for instance, has talked about the tea, that perhaps the local tea that can be used to arrest or to deal with COVID-19. So really exploring very broadly what as a country you can do, and flexibilities within the planning system to be able to respond to shocks, to be able to respond to crises such as COVID-19. I think I would stop here, Amson, and perhaps give the floor back to you to continue the process. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very engaging presentation. And I think now we can turn to our two respondents, Ms. Susanna Sumku and Ms. Kari Grenade. You have 5 minutes each.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. Great. So I'm Susanna, and I'm connecting with you from Mongolia. I think very crucial points have been already mentioned in the previous presentation and the two presentations, as well as the respondents' remarks. But in Mongolia's case, as we all know, every country has different needs, the history, and the political economic environments. And I think in Mongolia's case, Mongolia has a history of planning. I mean, we were a Soviet country before the 1990s, so there was a strong foundation of development policy planning. But again, with the democratic governance reform changes, it's been really interesting to see how the role of policy planning in the institutions regained more importance, and then looking at how SDGs really affect. And I think I want to make a few points. In terms of integrating, I usually like to say localizing the SDGs.
Yo no me doy cuenta, me están llegando al spam. Bueno, hoy me di cuenta de otro correo que mandó
I think it's really important to make sure that these are really ingrained into the local context, into the local mindset, the policy processes and implementation procedures. So also to help understand policymakers and politicians the role of SDGs in sustainable development. That's why
Susanna,
que te está llegando también a correo.
there's also somebody who is also speaking in the background. Fred, can you mute everybody and then give Susanna the chance again?
Entonces dice,
okay, great.
Señora.
Okay, I think you can go ahead, Susanna. Susanna, we cannot hear you. Susanna, can you unmute and speak?
There we go. Sorry about that. So what I like to say is usually localizing the SDGs, because from the government of Mongolia, and as a person who's technically in charge of the SDGs, working with all line ministries, the parliament and government, I can honestly admit that many people still don't understand what the SDGs are, what do they mean to regular Mongolian people, to politicians, to policymakers. And oftentimes it is regarded as something that's been adopted by the UN. So we've been really working hard to help change the mindset around what we think about SDGs and sustainable development. And to do that, we basically took two approaches. First one is to really, again, change the structure, how institutions work, and basically trying to enter the mandates and the roles of government institutions and what they do. So basically include the role of developing policies, planning policies towards achieving sustainable development as part of their terms of reference, as part of their sort of annual working plans for each agency. So similar to that, Mongolia has been working to amend our development policy planning law, including other regulations that are basically the guideline for how you plan policies. And this is a commonly used regulation by all policy planners across the country to basically amend the law so that it includes concepts around policy coherence and tangible tools and approaches which could be used systematically. So the aim has really been to create a system of coherence, system of breaking down silos across ministries and mandates, so then we could actually tackle the policies. And one example is that in the past 3 years, we've assessed the existing policy documents since the 1990s. So Mongolia is at the milestone of 30-year democratic sort of regime development era. And when we reflect back on how we've been in the past 30 years, Mongolia had around 560 development policies, including plans and various programs. And I mean, we're a country of a bit over 3 million people. And so 560 policies is really a huge number. And then at the moment, there are about 200 national level development policies are in effect. And when we look at it, the coherence are really lacking across environment, economic, and social policy targets. And the lack of analysis on the trade-offs and what these the different development pillars mean as a whole really made us to think, oh, we need to do something in terms of introducing more systematic approaches to how we plan policies. So really tackling the process of how we plan through legislative changes, through regulations, and then again, developing the necessary tools and approaches by working with international organizations and international think tanks, such as the Stockholm Environment Institute, ADB, UNESCAP. So I think the key message I want to get across is that every government obviously has different approaches and the situation is very different. But I think two things that really helped in how we tackle and how we localize the SDGs has been institutional changes, reforms, which we are slowly trying to do, and it does take a lot of time. And then secondly, building the capacity, but not just training and doing workshops, actually giving the tools and approaches in their hands, and then teaching them how to use it. And one good example for Mongolia has been, we've developed a policy coherence checking tool, which has been amended into basically the Bible for developing policies. This is a regulation that's approved by the government. And so using this regulation now, every policy is obligated to check the coherence of policies. And this process is done in a participatory manner. So what we wanted to do is usually what happens is one ministry or one agency develops a document, and then right before approving it, they bring together all these people from various stakeholders, and then they give an hour or two to take comments and remarks. And we don't think this is a meaningful process for stakeholder engagement. What we wanted to do is basically we sit down with all these stakeholders together, and then we identify the problem that is an obstacle for us to reach the sustainable development goals that we've set for ourselves, and then work together to identify a viable solution. And yeah, admittedly, there is a lot of arguments and disagreements, and a lot of people are coming from various different points. Some are farmers, some are legislators. So this process of maybe the arguments and the disagreements, we find it very valuable because it's a huge learning process. It's also a learning process for the government. And as such, we are trying to create a bottom-up policy-making process that's also in synergy with the top-down policy coherence approaches that we usually do within the government by the government officers. In terms of COVID-19, Mongolia is luckily at the moment, we don't have a public outbreak yet. So all of the cases have been imported at the moment. But again, Mongolia is situated right between China and Russia. So we are at a very critical geopolitical territory. And as such, I would say Mongolia has taken very good preventive action since mid-January, in having everybody wear masks and washing hands. So planning out sort of mass advocative activities. And I think the planning for preventive actions really showed that we can work together from various different stakeholders. Media has come together and worked with the government, the Ministry of Health, and people have been very, I would say, collaborative with what the government actions have been done. And of course, there's been an economic stimulus package. There's been 2 phases. The last one was rolled out beginning of May. And then we've also passed a law to combat COVID. The law basically focuses on identifying the various roles and obligations by different stakeholders in trying to firstly prevent, but also combat, in addition to dealing with the socio-economic impact of the pandemic. And I think one point that I wanted to raise is that within the economic stimulus packages, I would say that 50 to 60% of it really target vulnerable groups in Mongolia, which I think is really highlighting for the Mongolian public, but also decision makers, that vulnerable groups are at risk of not benefiting from development benefits or reaping out of the positive policy impacts. And I think this really highlighted because at the moment there are, for instance, actions to reduce personal and corporations income taxes, exemption from social insurance, basically to support private sector. There's a child allowance to all children in Mongolia. There's also food stamp doubling activity here as well. Also action towards supporting seniors, persons with disabilities, orphaned, half-orphaned, single mothers as well. So I think those have been, I actually commend these kind of actions because without having COVID, we usually talk about the importance of vulnerable groups, without highlight SDGs, but I think the virus really highlighted that, if the economy is really unstable as it is now and it continues to be, vulnerable groups now will not have any other possibility to basically, survive. So think moving forward, pandemic, let's try to find long-term the
I think we lost you. Susanna, can you hear us?
Yes, I've just been muted. Yeah. So one very minor and last point I wanted to make is that Mongolia, we've been testing out some potential tools like forecasting, scenario planning last year with colleagues from UNSCAP and consultants who've been hired. So I think now we realize, you know, those kind of tools could really be helpful if we can explore that. But again, pandemic is a pandemic. We usually don't have a time and it's very unpredictable. So we would have to see how it goes. But again, even if we get over the pandemic, it will be important for us to keep the principle of leaving no one behind, keep the, keep highlights on how do we make sure we reach basic social services to vulnerable groups, and how do we support the private sector without burdening the current budgets and resources that we have. So I think overall the COVID-19 is really showing the possibilities that can be used to improve how we, where we direct policy decisions, as well as how we can allocate the budget and the resources that we already have. For instance, like this, we don't have to organize this meeting in one place where we travel and all this stuff. This can be done online, and it is saving a lot of resources as well. So those would be my very brief remarks, and we'd be happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Susanna, for a very insightful inputs. Now, Kari, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Greetings from the Caribbean. So I will give some general perspectives on the Caribbean and then zoom in on Grenada briefly. So in the context of the Caribbean, some of you may or may not know that the Caribbean region is perhaps one of the most trade and tourism dependent region in the world. In some economies, tourism accounts for about 80% of the economy, and large jobs and government revenue arise from tourism. In addition, the Caribbean region is also highly vulnerable to climate change, one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world again. As well, very high rates of poverty, very high youth unemployment rate in some countries. The youth unemployment rate is twice the adult rate, and in some countries, the adult rate is about 40%. Acute gender imbalances, highly indebted countries. So that is just a snapshot of the Caribbean context. And I think in the context of COVID, you would see how COVID has really collided with these long-standing challenges. But notwithstanding, I think COVID presents an opportunity really to reset, to reimagine, to rethink new development paradigms. Certainly, we have an opportunity now to address the current development paradigms and economic models that perpetuate these challenges that the Caribbean, these small island development states face. Economic models that are not necessarily rooted in moral values, economic models and development paradigms that perpetuate gender and income inequalities, that retard poverty reduction, that undermines environmental sustainability, and so on. And so there is definitely an opportunity, and a lot of speakers spoke already about the opportunities, but certainly in the Caribbean, opportunities to really reshape development paradigm, to reshape institutions, governance, arrangements, and policies and approaches to sustainable development. So certainly a systems thinking approach is absolutely critical at this point. We have in the past have had a very siloed approach to development planning and programming. That of necessity must change, and we must move to a more integrated, holistic approach with policy coherence, as my colleague from Mongolia said, and where decision makers really take a more strategic and give a laser-like focus on policies and action that matter. That is crucially important because we really don't have time to waste. Our development challenges are just too acute for the old normal. We have to really move towards the new normal of doing things better and smarter. And so the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Principles in general, I think provides a very good construct to organize economic recovery, but more importantly, economic restructuring. So while some of the SDG targets themselves may have to be reset, but the goals themselves, I think, provide a very good organizing construct for the Caribbean to move forward. And I don't think that there is a better organizing framework for sustainable living and sustainable livelihoods than the SDGs and the principles of sustainable development in general. So in the case of Grenada, we recently approved our National Sustainable Development Plan, Vision 2035, last November. It was approved in Parliament. And I think COVID, the pandemic and the crisis can be used as a catalyst to achieve some of the development objectives in that national plan. And certainly we have a framework, coordinating mechanism to actually translate ideas and suggestions into action, because we know that strategy documents, they cannot self-implement. There must be an underpinning, coordinating mechanism, very coherent and durable and robust, with a proper governance and accountability mechanisms rooted in results to translate the ideas and aspirations of the people into actual action on the ground to improve their lives and those of the family and communities. So in terms of the Grenada's approach to moving beyond alignment, I would say the first thing was really to have a country-owned development vision. Ownership must transcend government ownership. Government ownership has to be country ownership. And so a whole of society approach is important in shaping a common vision and common destiny. So that is very important, country ownership. And that involves all stakeholders in the development process, whether it's public sector, private sector, NGOs, organized NGOs, unorganized NGOs, grassroots organizations, the academy youth in particular, very important, given that about 60% of the population is under 30. So youth involvement in the development process is crucially important. And of course, we have, my colleague from Mongolia made a crucial point. We have to localize the SDGs. In a lot of instances, the average person in the street in the Caribbean, the SDGs, they don't know what that means. And so it has to be mainstreamed throughout society. And how do we do that in a practical sense? And in Grenada, we were trying to do that by at least starting in the school, so embedding the SDGs and sustainable development principles and concepts in the curricula so that it is mainstreamed formally. And of course, you have to address as well informal sector, grassroots organization. So sustained engagement through public education. We try not to stay away from the term consultation, because a lot of the time consultation connotes the idea of an event. Stakeholder consultation is not an event, and it ought not to be treated as that. You just can't come and make a presentation on the SDGs and the benefits and then leave people there. The engagement has to be sustained, and there must be formal arrangements for sustaining the engagement. So new community organizations, grassroots organizations, having public engagement constantly to reinforce the importance of the SDGs and sustainable development principles in general. And so there in Grenada, we are trying to create genuine spaces and entrench these so that the ordinary person's voices can be heard and they can be part of the process. And that was done in terms of the formulation of the plan, and it continues in terms of the implementation of the plan. So in the context of COVID, some of the priority actions in the plan are going to be front-loaded, whether it's to support a green recovery. So for example, one specific example now is that we are going to be rolling out a tree planting program across the country, planting trees, so that it gives persons who have been laid off from the tourism sector, for example, an opportunity now to be engaged in short-term employment. And it also supports our environmental sustainability objectives. And so there are task force organized intersectorially to coordinate the rollout of some of these programs. And so that is why it is so important that we have genuine stakeholder engagement in the operationalization of the national plan, and its implementation of actions. The public sector can't do it alone. The private sector certainly can't do it alone. We need feasible cohesion and genuine involvement, not tokenism, genuine involvement and inclusion of ordinary citizens in the development process. And another important point is to have, in Grenada, we've established now a coordinating entity to be responsible for the rollout of the national plan, and by extension, the 3-year medium-term operational strategies that are responsible for bringing the national plan to life, so to speak. And so the Sustainable Development Institute is being organized to coordinate this, and it's going to be the coordinating entity for the SDGs in Grenada as well. Its mandate is going to be enshrined in legislation, so the draft Sustainable Development legislation has already been prepared, and it's really to mainstream sustainable development principles and practices across society. As I said, it's crucially important that all stakeholders are aware of the importance of the SDGs, are aware of the importance of realizing the development vision that we've set for ourselves. And two points before I wrap up. I think it is important. COVID has really shown us the necessity of having built-in flexibility in the national planning process and the national programming process. Priorities will have to be reset because situations out of country's control happen, like pandemics. But of course, if the broad development vision remains relevant, then the means to get to that vision can always change. And so built-in flexibility is absolutely important in the planning process. As well, I think in terms of COVID specifically, it has really exposed the extent of informality in Grenada and by extension, a lot of other countries in Africa. And so the balance between lives and livelihoods become a real one, because in certain areas that are densely populated, where people live on daily wages, where informality is so pervasive, there's really not there's the balance between lives and livelihoods become a sort of false dichotomy. It's not either or. People have to live because they live on daily wages. They are so densely populated, they can't do the physical distances. So these are real challenges that small island development countries face. And in that context, how do we deploy some realistic sort of arrangements and protocols and actions to really protect the most vulnerable? And this is really what is in focus now. How do we practically save lives and save livelihood at the time? Because it's really, in some small countries, a false dichotomy. We can't do either or. We have to do both simultaneously. And these are the sort of challenges, social inequalities that COVID has exposed and really there's an opportunity now for countries to really address these issues in a frontal way, whether by having much more deeper reforms to the social protection architecture, deeper reforms to social protection systems, really having a handle on who the most vulnerable in the population are. Women, and in a lot of instances, are disproportionately affected. And so gender issues are very, very important as well. And just one final point before I wrap up is that the Caribbean, as I mentioned at the outset, is highly vulnerable to natural disasters. And so we have a lot of crises colliding at this moment. The health crisis, economic crisis, and of course the climate crisis. And so there is a situation where Caribbean countries, because of the high GDP per capita, because of course some of their populations are quite small, so some of the Caribbean countries have very high GDP per capita, and so they are not allowed to access concessional financing. Now, we know in the context of a hurricane, and some of you may be aware, we had very devastating hurricanes in the Caribbean within the past 3 years, Hurricane Irma, Maria, Dorian last year. And the GDP per capita of countries can be wiped out. I mean, decades or even generations of development gains can be eroded in 2 or 3 hours with a category 5 or 6 or 7 hurricane. And in that context, some Caribbean countries, for example, Barbados or Bahamas, which have supposedly high GDP per capita, cannot access concessional financing from the World Bank, or cannot access the IMF rapid credit facility that's 0 interest rate because of the per capita income. And I think this is really a travesty that the global community must once and for all of necessity address. You know, that the one of the metric for determining access to concessional funds must be vulnerability as measured by our vulnerability to climate change and other natural hazards, and not just GDP per capita. And in that context, we need much stronger global solidarity, a global, moral justice, really, when it comes to the Caribbean in terms of how the region is treated in terms of access to concessional financing. And that being said, I just want to put on the table that Caribbean governments have responsibility as well. They cannot absolve themselves. Fiscal indiscipline has played a role in the high indebtedness in the past. And that is why a lot of the Caribbean countries are now moving to having fiscal responsibility frameworks with enshrined fiscal rules that will entrench fiscal discipline and will have a stronger fiscal buffers to address some of these crises. Grenada did this in 2016. And so it faced this crisis with a little more fiscal buffers, but that is not the case for the majority of Caribbean countries. And so I just really want to call for stronger global solidarity to really recognize the vulnerabilities, the acute vulnerabilities of small island development states of the Caribbean. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Carrie, for that very interesting presentation. So we have a couple of minutes to go. So I'll maybe throw a few questions, and then maybe if you want to ask a question, I think I'll give you the floor. But quickly, I have some questions for Boitumelo. What tools did Botswana use to integrate the SDGs and to assess the extent of integration or alignment? Were Agenda 2063 goals and targets integrated as well? Was risk assessment an integral part of the planning process? And another part of the question also says what type of capacity building was done in Botswana to allow the implementation of the structured approach? And for Susanna and Carrie, maybe you can think about this question while Boitumelo is responding. Ms. Eunice Ajambo from Namibia is asking, how does fiscal planning factor in the process of integrating the 23rd Agenda into national plans and strategies considering COVID-19 response and recovery? Melo, you can have the floor.
Thank you, Emson. If I got you right, it is about the tools that were used by the country to integrate the SDGs in planning. And if Agenda 2063 is also a part or has been integrated in the planning instruments, I think that is, and what capacity building has been developed for this structured approach. Okay. I think, as I said, with regard to the planning process in Botswana, and I think it was very deliberate for me to talk about what the country's national development plans have been constructed. To say, what are the challenges that as a country we face? What are the obligations or the commitments that we have taken regionally, continentally, and globally? And what programs and projects or policies do we have in place that could address these priorities or these challenges that we have? Consultative process, as I indicated, bottom-up approach, where at the subnational level, for instance, you have a planning process that would yield for every district or subnational territory an urban or a district development plan that takes into account the circumstances at the local level and involving a very high-level participatory process, including all sorts of groups and stakeholders. And that builds to the national level planning process, where then the national development plan is an accumulation of all these districts and urban development plans. But still, even at the national level, they still have their district or urban development plans to take into account or to implement. When the Sdg agenda or when the 2030 agenda was approved in September 2015, it came at the time when this process to develop the national and urban development plans was taking place, and which plans became effective in April 2017. So the Agenda 2063, Agenda 2030, the national priorities or challenges to be addressed, they all were accumulated and became part of the consultations and how they could be integrated in the plans. So Agenda 2063 is very much a part of the agenda. What is lacking, as I indicated in my presentation, is how to meaningfully track the indicators that come with these continental and global frameworks. Again, as I said, what has been a limiting factor is the lack of data that supports analysis, that supports decision-making. And therefore, that has been the major constraint that we have to deal with. But I think to a very large extent, as I indicated, our plans, the sequence in terms of development coming from the Agenda 2063 to the UN Agenda 2030, all these became part and parcel of the planning process, and the engagements that would normally take place from bottom in that consultative process ensured that all these commitments are part of our national development plan and the vision document. The planning guidelines are relatively a new concept. and we are still at a stage where we are rolling them out. And as I indicated, the COVID, this crisis came at a time when we were just at the beginning of engaging the 6 ministries to roll out this but they are a very highly consultative process. They are a capacity development initiative, and throughout the stages, there is an assurance that those that will be involved in the different ministries, there is a certain level of capacity that is going to be developed, which helps them to prioritize, which helps them, for instance, to evaluate if the particular targets and indicators are relevant, which helps them to collect the data, to understand the indicators first, and to collect the data around the indicators. And we are setting this process up with the involvement of the UN system, such that the UN system can participate in the process with the ministries to also help with the necessary skills and capacities to deal with the different capacity requirements pertaining to the implementation of the indicators. So a lot of capacity building that we envisage, and we were lucky that we had also sought for funding through the UN system to support this process, and that was also granted to us. And therefore, as part of rolling out the planning guidelines, capacity is going to be part and parcel of the process. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Boy. Now I give the floor to Susanna and Kari to respond to the fiscal question.
Yeah, just quickly on the fiscal question, I mean, certainly the budget process is crucially important to support the implementation of any national plan. You know, to move from ideas to action, you need a budget. In the context of COVID and in the context of Grenada's fiscal responsibility framework, there is an escape clause in there that can be relaxed so that government right now can engage in counter-cyclical fiscal policies, meaning to increase its spending to respond to COVID. So that is exactly what is happening now. The stimulus package, well, the care package, I'm not sure to call it stimulus. The care package has been announced, and it really targets the vulnerable groups in society, payroll and income support for the unemployed, unemployment benefits, and so on. And the relaxing of the fiscal escape clauses has allowed the government to engage in increased spending to address COVID at this moment.
Thanks a lot. Susanna, you have anything to add from Mongolia's perspective?
I completely agree with what Carrie just said. I just want to link it with the core concept of SDGs. I think it's fair to say that oftentimes during a time of a crisis or conflict, it's easy for national countries or national governments to focus on the domestic needs. In other words, you know, putting the agendas and the many different international commitments that we have, because the people, there's a very real problem that we are seeing outside. I mean, people are sick and there's a lot of action to be done. So I'm just thinking, you know, how can we make sure that during this times of crisis and conflict, we are still considering the core concepts of leaving no one behind, core concepts of justice and peace and coherence and, you know, reducing poverty. I think it's important, for instance, thinking about Mongolia. Firstly, we need to make sure that SDGs are integrated and localized into how we plan budgets, as well as how we conduct fiscal management. Budgets are just one component of fiscal policy and management. There's a lot of components that we need to think about, such as taxes. And during times of crisis, for instance, in Mongolia, with our current law to combat COVID-19 and our economic stimulus package, we can kind of see that we are planning, we are reallocating funds, thus we are reaching vulnerable groups. But after the pandemic, it's important that we keep working towards integrating the SDGs and making sure that the budgets and the fiscal policy is really directed towards priority SDG targets within the country. And one example I can draw as a solution is currently there's current work being done to tag SDGs within specific sectoral budget planning processes. For instance, in the past 2 years, our Ministry of Finance has worked with the Ministry of Health in helping them tag, basically like map out what kind of, which SDG targets and indicators are they hitting when they plan and identify certain policy actions within the annual policy and the budget that they are proposing to the government. So again, as you all know, Ministry of Finance integrates all of the budget proposals from all sectors and then integrates it and then makes sure that it's comprehensive along with the fiscal policy. So at the moment, this is a trial and it is working in only specific sectors, but moving forward, we need to make sure that all of the national SDG targets and indicators that we are currently identified and is yet to be approved by the Parliament of Mongolia is again coherent with the budgets and the fiscal policy. So I think this is a very quick question about linking budgets and policy planning. So this is, I think, an important issue that we need to keep thinking about. Talking about COVID-19, again, it's very difficult, you know, we're allocating the budget, we have the economic stimulus package, but how can we measure, for instance, those actions? How can we measure the kind of impact those actions are making along with the SDGs and the targets that we've set at the national level? So I think this is an interesting question, and I think to basically find a solution to this answer, we need to make sure that we are working systematically again to localize the SDGs into policy systems, as well as the budget planning and fiscal policy management mechanisms.
Thanks a lot for that. Maybe in the interest of time, I'll take two burning questions from anyone. If anyone has a burning question, just unmute and ask your question.
Okay, I'm Frederick from Zambia, Frederick Chilongo.
Go ahead.
Yes, my question is that the SDGs, when they were being about government, it was achieved by the year 20. How do you think it affects our progress in achieving those goals, especially even for those low-income countries? Yes, that's my question.
Okay, thank you for that. Anyone else who wants to pose a question, you can unmute, and you can also indicate who you want who do you want to respond to the question.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes, it's Rulen Baloy from South Africa. My question is around prioritization, because in this age of COVID-19, especially in the context of SDGs, I don't think there's that rigorous thinking around how to prioritize SDGs, because, for instance, in terms of stimulus measures that come forward, in some governments, even from South Africa, I will say presidency is the one which takes the lead in spearheading efforts around post-COVID-19 recovery without necessarily engaging key ministries of environment, planning, and economy. So I wanted to ask that, how to recalibrate our plans to make sure that even in the age of COVID-19, we still take into account what we set out to do from our NDPs and other planning tools that are in place. Are there case studies that can help us to do just that?
Thank you. Susanna, Boy, and Carrie, you want to respond to those two questions, and then maybe take the last two.
Right, maybe I could take a stab at the first question about the relevance. I think as I said, the SDGs as an organizing framework and construct, I think remains absolutely relevant, even in the context of COVID. I suspect that some of the specific targets may have to be reset for the reasons precisely that you're articulating. But in terms of an overarching framework for governance, for sustainability, for inclusion, for peace, for prosperity, I'm not sure that there is any other robust framework there for humanity outside of the SDGs. I know that there are lots of, different schools of thought with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals, its conceptualization. They are very, they are trade-offs. Some may challenge its whole ideology and philosophical principles in terms of whether it promotes the same neoliberal agenda. But these issues aside, I think generally it still remains relevant. And certainly at the country level, priorities will definitely have to be reset given this pandemic and this crisis. And that is why it is so important that national strategic documents are designed with built-in flexibility to cater to changing priorities.
Thank you. Boy?
Just building on what Kari has just said, or where she just left off about building on the priorities and the flexibilities of the national development plans, that is very, very critical, because national development plans should be flexible enough to respond to the challenges, to the shocks that may hit the economy at any time. I think that is important. But it is also important, and I agree with the speaker with Frederick from Zambia, that it is also a challenge given the fiscal space that is available within the countries. Countries are not necessarily the same. Countries are at different stages of development, and how they comprehend and deal with the development agenda really rests on the capabilities of a country and the fiscal space within which it is operating. Indeed, from the reports that we have seen on the SDGs going to the high-level political forum on a year-by-year basis, and especially the report of the 2019 was very, very clear that there are quite numerous challenges with regard to attainment of certain, some of the goals. While there has been some progress with regard to some of the targets, goals within the global framework, but there are indeed some challenges with regard to some. And there was a lot of doubt with regard to whether all the goals and all those targets that countries have set themselves will be achieved by 2030. But the starting point for each and every country should really be about where do our priorities fall and where do we focus our attentions to start with. Where are the priorities? Where do we focus our attention? And as I indicated earlier, some of the targets to be achieved will be very much dependent on progress that is being made with regard to some of the other targets in the framework, or the priorities that are there in the framework. So it is important that, of course, countries engage in a manner that would in a way shape how they would want to move with this development agenda. Very important, where do we start? In a very sequential manner, in a way that would also allow for building on the achievements that have been made and ensuring that as we progress towards 2030, there is meaningful progress that has been attained. It will be very unlikely that national development plans, because there are also plans or frameworks that cover a specific period of time, will enable countries to put and work with everything that the SDG agenda has, and therefore prioritization at any point is very important. I think that is what I can say at this point in time.
Thanks a lot, Boitumelo. Does anyone want to say anything?
Yeah, I'll just, I wanted just to make a very brief point on prioritization. This, I think this is a very, very important point, you know, is this prioritization within national policies and national policy actions are fair? Does it really represent the views of, you know, not only the government, but also of people? I think this is a very important issue to talk about. It not only touches the concepts around trade-offs, policy coherence, systems thinking, but what I wanted to basically highlight is what Lachlan and Admos mentioned earlier on, that planning, the process of planning is really becoming very dynamic and it's changing. There's almost a new era of how we plan development policies, AKA how we see and envision the future. And I think when we think about that, I really think about what kind of process do we need so that development policy planning process and the policies themselves substantively are most effective and are inclusive and are driving towards sustainable development. And I think an important point, I think Admus mentioned, is that, you know, many governments are still using like input-output tables, you know, very technical, like, you know, models. And of course, Mongolia uses it too. And in fact, we plan on using these cross-sectoral, you know, economic models and econometric approaches. But an important point that the new policy planning approach that colleagues earlier on mentioned is that we need to think about a more holistic and participatory way of how we plan policies and plans. And I think this is what, this is the key to making sure that there is consensus on how we prioritize policies and the kind of policy actions that we develop as a whole of society. And I think this is not, again, like I mentioned during my remarks, this is not done during a webinar, this is not done during a seminar or a workshop or a one-time training. This needs to be systematically included as a long-term sort of, whether it be a platform where stakeholders come in and they are open to discuss, you know, what kind of issues they have, the needs and the actions they most need. And potentially during this pandemic and COVID-19, of course, ICT and technology will play a critical role. And I think in Mongolia, there is, I think, a vivid discussion going on online, whether that be at the main website of the parliament or the government, or even social media and just media in general. They're doing a good job in representing the people's views. And again, one last point I wanted to mention is oftentimes it can be difficult to, of course, engage many people. So I think civil society organizations come into this with a critical role. I don't think civil society organizations, of course, as well as private sector, are meaningfully being engaged in how we prioritize policies or how we plan policies in general. So I think moving forward in the future, governments, of course, need to do a better job to create the necessary platforms so that it's not just ad hoc working groups and one-time meetings that really, you know, address multi-stakeholder engagement. So the key answer is really to engage people and make sure that it is a consultative process in how we prioritize policies. So, you know, we can do all the analysis and modeling and come up with the numbers, but that process needs to be inclusive, basically. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I know we have gone over our previous, I think we were supposed to finish at 11, but we had some technical issues. So I'll entertain our last two questions, if anyone has two questions, and then I'll conclude. So you can unmute and just pose your question.
Hello, this is Penny Sessler-Brandon with Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society for Nursing. My question is, first of all, I want to thank you for this excellent panel who discussed so many incredible issues. But my big question is, we do want to get the government to, all governments, to be actively engaged. And I'm wondering how some countries are doing that, because that's always a challenge. And I'm just wondering what might be some of the core things that they are using to engage and to actively have the governments committed to achieving the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina, for that question. One last one. If there's no one, I can ask any of the panelists to respond to Nina's question.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Hello?
You can go ahead.
This is Dr. Najat Ishaqi from Bahrain. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Well, I'm an academic person also, or academia major group also. Well, we've been here in Bahrain. First, let me thank you for this wonderful, discussion. So many things to be discussed, and I'm sure that when we receive the recorded one, we'll be following. Here in Bahrain, we've been doing a lot of initiatives and a lot of policy changes. Government have been supporting, the individuals. Loans have been waived, supporting the SMEs. So many things have been done. But our neighbors like Saudi Arabia, they've been raising the
We lost you. Najat, we lost you. You can repeat your question. Najat, can you unmute and...
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard that or not, but like I said, that our neighbor Saudi Arabia now, what they did, that they raised the taxes. Here in Bahrain, we haven't done this, but the people are wondering now, what is the best way to, to combat or to deal with the COVID-19, with respect of the economy? Is raising the taxes is better, or to reduce or keep the taxes? This is one thing, so that you can have the liquidity. If you raise the taxes, the people will become afraid, so that they will not spend. So this will give us another problem. But if you maintain, the liquidity, it means that you will have another problem. And the other thing, one of your panelists mentioned about the holistic, policies that in order to implement the SDG. I'm wondering now in here, for us as a sustainable development consultant, how can we get ourselves involved in this kind of things? Is it going to be through United Nations, or do we have to have a kind of collaboration work in here? I don't know. What is the best way to do this kind of thing? Thank you very much again.
Thank you. Our panelists, you can pick any part of the questions and respond.
If I could just quickly comment on how do we engage governments. This is a very, very important point. Again, like I mentioned, I don't think there's enough understanding around SDGs and sustainable development concept in general. So in Mongolia's case, I think in general, the most difficult thing is to get high-level support, high-level understanding, and potentially this could be like parliament or president's level. In Mongolia, the issue of SDGs lie within the government. So under the mandate of the prime minister, we have a National Council for Sustainable Development led by the prime minister. We also have a parliamentary subcommittee parliament level. So these are helpful, but I think those kind of structures are usually like committees and councils, and they are comprised of very high level people like ministers and parliament members. Oftentimes it's difficult to bring them together and have, in-depth and meaningful discussions. So as such, to really get the government, informed about SDGs and get excited, I think there needs to be a champion within the government. So for instance, in our case, the National Development Agency, where the organization that I work has been coordinating and leading the work on SDGs. But we do realize in the past 3 years that because we're an agency, oftentimes the status tends to be low. So that's why according to the recent constitutional amendments, only last week, we have amended our law on development policy planning, meaning that our organization will be upgraded to a ministry led by a deputy prime minister, basically. So this will give us the right mandate within the government to basically really systemize and give the proper technical and understanding around SDGs. So I think a champion is really important, but then champion, of course, needs to be, at various different levels, but it's better if I think technical level within the government, there's a strong role, strong institution that is not only, well connected within the government, but also with private sector, civil society. So oftentimes I know that this tends to be either the planning ministry, planning organization, or development agencies and ministries. In regards to the question on holistic approach, and the last question. So we've been really trying to look at new and innovative tools and approaches to firstly localize, integrate SDGs, but also to assess coherence within our national policies, because we think that there's SDGs, but we also have the Paris Agreement, the Sendai framework. There's a lot of international commitments and development agendas that we need to consider as a government. So to do that, I like to usually say we need to clean the house, make sure that the ongoing existing policies and institutional frameworks are, coherent, they're ready, and they're adaptive to the different development agendas, so that we can also engage in the global process of moving towards sustainable development. And as such, how do we, get in the discussion around holistic approaches? We've basically, contacted various organizations. We've done research. I'm a senior specialist and I do a lot of policy analysis work, but I've been doing, research on my own, just Googling things, And one resource that I could potentially reference is the Asian Development Bank has implemented a project on integrating environmental SDGs into socio-economic SDGs. And within this project, we've produced this report, a tool compendium of basically SDG linkages, approaches and tools. So this is online and you can look at it. And I think this is a good resource where you could see what kind of tools and approaches are existing globally. And it not only talks about the T21 model by the Millennium Institute, it also talks about Stockholm Environment Institute's policy interlinkages, the 7-point system tool. And these are all, quite innovative and new approaches and tools that could be used. And of course, in our case, we've used those tools and we've localized it to make sure it fits into our national policy processes. I hope this is helpful.
Thank you, Susanna.
Yes, just to also share a bit of experience with regard to government's involvement, to say that yes, indeed, there are challenges. We still have in Botswana, regardless of the fact that the SDGs constitute
Boitumelo, we cannot hear you. I think there is so much background noise now. Okay, you can give it a try.
One question, please. I am Dr. Sunita Madan from India. My question is regarding food and hunger. Food, clothing, and shelter are the main basic needs of a person. Problem of food and
I think we have lost you. So Boitumelo, you can conclude your intervention. Boitumelo, you need to unmute.
Sorry, I was just going to share how we as a country have engaged the government or involved the government, but first to say that it is indeed a challenge across government, across all sectors of government. It is a challenge to deal with the SDG agenda and feel that it has been holistically accepted. Find in certain quarters where you have to do a lot of advocacy around SDGs because it is seen as something that could be termed as a UN agenda that comes with a lot of pressure in addition to the everyday work that people do. But I think it comes with a lot of misunderstanding of what this agenda is all about. And therefore, advocating and continuous education around SDGs, as my colleagues have said, is always very helpful. But I must say that we probably have a lot of positives in Botswana that in a way have made, to a large extent, the agenda to be quite well received and with government involvement at a very high level. We've had, for instance, following the adoption of the agenda in the country, we've had a communication strategy for the SDGs. And this communication strategy was launched at a very high level by the then Vice President. So from a political level, there has been a lot of buy-in already on the SDG or this UN agenda. The agenda resides within the Ministry of Finance, which is responsible for planning, which also hosts the Secretariat for the SDGs. And what I probably have to, the point to make here is the need for a very effective stakeholder coordination mechanism. I think it is important that the Secretariat, in our particular case of Botswana, that is responsible for SDGs, engages quite a lot with the stakeholders. There has been an institutional mechanism established, and at the very top level is made of permanent secretaries from all ministries. So that again shows a lot of commitment around the agenda. At the political level, for instance, there's a parliamentary committee, a parliamentary select committee on SDGs that has been established. And this committee has the responsibility for oversight over implementation of the agenda. So that is helpful. Of course, we have a new government that came in place towards the end of the year. And some of these committees are still new and have not really begun to function, to conduct their work in a much more effective way. But there is that committee, and that committee for us is a very important committee in ensuring that the agenda is owned in the country. The agenda is progressed in the country. So maybe that is some of the useful points to share around how we in Botswana find this process. But I still have to admit that there are challenges here and there in terms of really accepting this agenda, particularly at the technical level, and working with it. And as it is seen as something that brings additional burden. So advocacy is important on a continuous basis, and we continue to do that. But what helps? The integration of this agenda, the mainstreaming of this agenda in the National Development Plan. As you implement this plan, you know that we are satisfied that the SDG principles have been embedded in there. We just have to make sure that we then ensure that the specific targets, the specific goals are attended to in a much more structured and focused manner. Thank you very much.
Colleagues, I would like to thank you for your patience. We've been at this for almost, 2.5 hours or slightly longer. So it has been a long one, and I know many of you, especially those in the Asia region, it's already very late. I thank you for hanging in there. Otherwise, this has been a great start to our series. I think some key messages that we can take away from this webinar is that, yes, there are good practices in relation to national planning, as well as embedding plans in national reality. And there's also extensive participatory processes that are going on. We also heard that planning is flexible and to build in resilience in the face of COVID-19 as well as other shocks. We also kind of heard that I think a post-pandemic period will probably see an acceleration towards closing the digital divide. Whether we're talking of e-governance or e-learning, I think these are important things if we want to make sure that everyone gets to participate. More importantly, COVID-19 does present an opportunity. So while its human cost is so huge, as well as its economic impact, I think there are also opportunities for countries to come up with new development paradigms and solutions. We also need a national community of practice to drive this process forward, and that community of practice needs to be inclusive. We need to address data challenges, issues of policy coherence, and of course, we need champions to drive this work forward. Prioritizing may not be easy, but definitely we need to prioritize. And when governments prioritize, they need to listen to the views of everyone in society and not just to their own priorities. I think with those few remarks, I'll conclude today's session. So we meet again on Thursday morning, and I encourage you to register. Of course, unfortunately, today we lost Barry. He sent a message saying that he had some technical difficulties. He was trying to make his presentation, but we couldn't hear him. So maybe we'll try to give him some time on Thursday as well to make some remarks. Otherwise, thanks a lot, everyone, for this wonderful webinar. It has been great listening to you, and we will try to summarize the key messages from this session. We'll eventually post them on our website, so we'll keep you posted. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening